8% so far this year. During the ministerial talks, OPEC ministers reconfirmed their production adjustment plan, previously agreed to for adding 400,000 barrels a day of output in November. Oil prices have risen due to an increase in global demand and supply disruptions, and that did push Brent last week above $80 a barrel to near a 3-year high. So let's explore the latest developments on this particular story. Vincent McAvenny joins us now live from London. So Vincent, OPEC is forecasting that demand growth next year will be around 4.2 million barrels a day. Does the market concur with that view, or is that estimate seen to be a bit conservative?
Well, oil demand is set to rebound toward pre-pandemic levels above 100 million barrels per day at some point next year, according to 4 of the major tracking groups. High prices on oil markets, as you mentioned, are because OPEC and allied producers still have millions of barrels per day of oil production offline after they made record cuts to supply during the pandemic to match plummeting demand for transport fuel. But OPEC are offering a robust prediction for demand rebound, demand rebound, putting the recovery date at the second quarter of 2022, which the market seems to concur with.
So let's take the OPEC demand forecast at face value, right? Using that as our baseline, can members other than Saudi Arabia pump in the extra crude that the market is crying for now? Because some producers like Nigeria, for example, haven't even met their production quotas. Their output this year has been declining. So who can step in with spare production capacity other than the Saudis?
Well, demand is hypersensitive to what happens in Saudi Arabia. Just think back to the 2019 missile attack, which knocked out virtually all its spare capacity and drove prices to their highest levels in months. But others do have supplies on tap. The International Energy Agency says that along with the Saudis, Iraq, Kuwait and the UAE have also increased capacity. As for Nigeria, it and Angola are 2 African oil nations dogged by maintenance issues and underinvestment. They've underproduced by 250,000 barrels a day so far this year. Overall, there is plenty of spare oil out there, an estimated 50 million barrels or more a day, says the IEA.
Okay, so OPEC is forecasting that U.S. crude supply will only rise by about 80,000 barrels a day, right, over the remainder of the year. But given the supply side tightness we're seeing at the moment, why does OPEC think that crude production in the U.S. will remain relatively flat? What's the story there?
Well, we are still awaiting a recovery in U.S. Gulf production after the region was hit by a Category 4 hurricane, Hurricane Ida, in late August. It was the second most destructive hurricane to ever make landfall in the state of Louisiana, disrupting both offshore and onshore activity. Damage to offshore installations has cut cumulative oil production by more than 30 million barrels since late August, according to statistics from the U.S. Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. As a result, U.S. petroleum inventories have fallen to 4.5 to 5% below the pre-pandemic 5-year seasonal average, compared with a deficit of around 2.5% before the hurricane. And looking ahead to next year, some offshore production losses are expected to last into the first quarter of 2022.
It's interesting times in the oil market. Vincent McAvenny there in London. Thank you. Now back into the world of tech. Facebook's suite of apps, including the very popular, some would say very addictive, photo-sharing platform Instagram and the messaging app WhatsApp were down for tens of thousands of users, according to the outage tracking website downdetector.com. Now, shortly after that crash, user reports indicated that Amazon Web, Google and Twitter were also experiencing some issues too. Down Detector, which only tracks outages by collating status reports from a series of sources, including user-submitted errors on its platform, showed there were more than 50,000 incidents of people reporting issues with Facebook and Instagram. In the meantime, the social media giant's instant messaging platform WhatsApp was also down for over 20,000 users. Messenger was down for nearly 3,000 users. Away from the world of tech, the World Trade Organization revised its forecasts for growth of global goods trade this year and in 2022 higher, but it's warning of a 2-track recovery and some fairly significant downside risks from the COVID-19 pandemic and supply chain problems. The WTO says it expects merchandise trade to grow this year by 10.8% after a decline of 5.3% last year. In March, it had forecast 2021 growth of around 8%. The Geneva-based trade body said that trade growth should slow down to around 4.7% in 2022, more than its previous forecast, however, of 4%, with trade approaching its pre-pandemic long-term trend. The strong annual growth rate for merchandise trade in 2021 is mainly due to the collapse in 2020 when trade bottomed out in the second quarter of the year. Europe's gas shortages have boosted demand for flowers from East Africa, even though Kenya, which is a major producer in this part of the world, is struggling to take advantage of that opportunity because of freight capacity constraints. Soaring gas prices in continental Europe are eating away at the margins of greenhouses in the Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe. So some producers are now cutting their growing seasons in order to trim their fuel use, and that's forcing buyers to look for alternatives elsewhere. Kenya's horticultural exports, including fruits, vegetables and flowers, were worth about $1.37 billion last year, according to industry data. Comparable Ethiopian exports were worth $530 million in the fiscal year that ended on the 7th of July. Kenyan producers supply roughly a quarter of the cut flowers sold in Europe, with about 70% of Kenya's produce going through Amsterdam by air. We start our company Newswrap in South Africa. The Special Risk Insurers Association and the National Treasury have collectively announced that the state-owned insurer has received some $259 million to assist it to meet obligations until the end of the current fiscal year, including assisting businesses rocked by looting in July's unrest. Sasria aims to settle 80% of claims by the end of October. The International Finance Corporation is set to lend $15 million to Guarantee Trust Bank Kenya for onward lending to small and medium-sized enterprises. That loan is part of the IFC's funding of financial institutions in emerging markets under its COVID-19 crisis response program. The loans are designed to be dispersed to companies whose cash flows have been disrupted by the pandemic, helping to boost their working capital, among other needs. Airtel Africa, a provider of telecommunication services and mobile money services with a presence in 14 countries across Africa, has announced the appointment of Olusegun Ogunsanya as Managing Director and CEO. He started the new role on the 1st of October and joined the board of Airtel Africa. Prior to this, he was a Managing Director and CEO of Airtel Nigeria. And finally, the Japanese car maker Toyota outsold GM in the United States for the first 9 months of 2021, as the Detroit car maker struggled with production problems stemming from the semiconductor chip shortage. Toyota, in the first 9 months of the year, sold 1.86 million vehicles compared to GM's total figure of 1.78 million, or just 80,000 more vehicles. It's pretty tight margins here. GM has been the largest seller of vehicles in the United States since 1931, when it surpassed the Ford Motor Company. That's a run through your headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected efforts to deal with malaria. And coal producers in Zimbabwe get the green light to export some 200,000 tons of the fuel.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible? And why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Nairobi.
This
Well, of course.
is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. Now, the gap between the funds needed to decisively end malaria and the funds actually deployed was widening even before the COVID-19 pandemic. But health experts are now concerned that the pandemic may actually have slowed down efforts in dealing with the disease. It killed over 400,000 people in 2019 alone. Let's start with the money side of the problem, shall we? According to the World Health Organization, the funding gap doubled between 2017 and 2019 to over $2.5 billion. In 2019, at least $5.6 billion was needed to just stay on track with efforts to eliminate malaria, but only $3 billion was actually invested. Now, of that $3 billion, 70% of it came from international sources outside Africa. 1.1 billion of that actually came from the United States. Now, there is a significant concentration risk here, since in the decade in between 2007 and 2018, 25% of all R&D funding came from just one source, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, with the US through the National Institutes of Health investing nearly $2 billion in R&D, even though the bulk of the global malaria caseload is in sub-Saharan Africa. Between them, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Mozambique and Niger, they accounted for 51% of the global caseload in 2019. According to the WHO estimates, disruptions due to the COVID-19 pandemic may have resulted in an additional 10,000 to 100,000 deaths attributable to malaria in 2020. Now, to put that into context, the upper end of that estimate is about half of all deaths in Africa caused to date by COVID. Now, there is an additional problem to consider here when we're dealing with malaria: emerging drug resistance. Just last week, Novartis announced the results of phase 2 trials of a new drug to treat malaria. The good news is it demonstrated the same efficacy as ACT combination therapies that we're using now in that round of tests, even in children under 12. Some hours ago, I spoke to Dr. Nkoye Otsula. She's a Global Medical Affairs Director on malaria at Novartis. I started by exploring why it was absolutely important to have another mainline drug ready to deal with malaria, even when the current ones are about 98% effective.
What is a bigger concern for us today is the fact that we are seeing early signs of mutations to the malaria parasite, and these mutations code for resistance to artemisinin. And if we lose the artemisinin background, we're going to lose the other drug that it is combined with. So we do not want to wait until we're in complete failure, like we were in the 90s, and we have no option, before we start looking to see what can we use to, what drugs, what other options would be available on that day when the drugs are no longer working. So we are being proactive.
Indeed.
In order to have treatment options.
Do we know what's driving this resistance? Is this just natural adaptation, for lack of a better word, of the malaria parasite to the sort of things that it's having to deal with in its common environment, or are there other factors that are driving this adaptation?
Resistance is a naturally occurring phenomenon. So when you have a new drug, then the parasites will always try to outsmart that new drug that you have. So eventually, any anti-malarial or even antibiotic to step out further would eventually fail. However, there are things that we do that drive resistance. For example, people who have malaria and are prescribed an anti-malarial and then don't complete the treatment. They feel better in 1 or 2 days and don't complete the dose. What they're doing in their body is selecting for those parasites which are resistant to the treatment or partially resistant to the treatment that they're receiving, and they can then transmit these parasites to others.
And also there's this habit that we tend to have, at least in this side of the world, where, we'll self-medicate. We'll walk over to a pharmacist and say, well, I think I have these symptoms, I might have malaria, give me an anti-malarial, even though it may not necessarily be the case that we actually do have malaria.
And where this becomes dangerous is places where we have heavy malaria burden, like in the lakeside in Kenya, for example. We have people walking around with a sort of clinical immunity to the parasite. So they have low levels of parasites in their body, but they're not getting sick from them. So these individuals maybe have a headache for another reason, and then they go to the chemist and they get an anti-malarial, and then they don't complete it. So they would also be selecting for resistant parasites.
So the data that we've seen from these phase 2B trials, this looks fairly promising. Sample of 524 persons, and the efficacy of this particular drug is essentially comparable to what we're seeing with ACT combination therapies. Give us a summary of how this played out.
So the study was done in two parts. We had a part A, where there were adults and adolescents enrolled, and there were about 350 of those. And the drug was found to be safe and work well. Then we had a part B, which was the first time we were taking the drug to children less than 12 years, who would be our target age group. This is the age group where we have the highest burden of malaria. And the drug was found, considering all factors, to be comparable to artemisinin, to an ACT. So that's really exciting. The other thing that I need to underline here is that the drug was well tolerated. So it has a good safety profile. And the third thing is that compared to some of the ACTs, which are given twice daily, this drug is given once a day. So that's a great improvement.
Is malaria not getting the funding it deserves or the funding it needs simply because, well, it tends to be a tropical disease? 95% of those cases tend to be essentially in the tropics, in Nigeria, in Uganda, in the DRC.
In terms of funding, you get more visibility when a disease obviously affects a higher number of people or a broader geographical region. And the truth is, malaria is now mostly a disease of the tropics. This wasn't always so. As late as the First World War, there was malaria in the southern parts of Europe. But over and above foreign funding, we do need to ask ourselves, what are we doing locally as governments in endemic countries? What can we do as communities in endemic countries? Because the malaria funding is not, funding from funding partners is not the sole solution. There's a lot we can do ourselves to own our history in malaria or our future in malaria.
Let's turn to the business of energy. Coal producers in Zimbabwe have been given permission to export 200,000 tons of thermal coal due to limited intake of the country's largest thermal coal power plant. That's the Hwange power station. Now, coal exports are usually not permitted in order to guarantee there's a local supply, but producers said the coal will be exported to other countries in Southern Africa, maybe even beyond the region, if port facilities on demand is available. CGTN's Ramah Nyang has the details from Harare.
The Association of Coal Producers says stockpiles of power coal have been building up as a result of restricted uptake at the Hwange thermal power station. Now, ordinarily, coal miners supply about 300,000 tons of coal per month to the power station, but that has been slashed due to regular breakdowns, which have reduced its generation capacity. Commissioned some 34 years ago, Zimbabwe's biggest thermal power station is designed to generate about 920 megawatts of electricity, but has been producing less than half that, contributing to Zimbabwe's current energy crisis, which is characterized by rolling power cuts. Just over 1,200 megawatts of electricity is being generated per day against a demand of more than 1,700 megawatts. The coal producers say they will export their excess product to countries in the region and even further afield, provided port facilities are available. Ramah Nyang, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
On Sunday, Libya said work has started on the construction of an oil refinery in the south of the country. The project is forecast to cost anywhere between $500 to $600 million. According to the head of Libya's state oil company, Mustafa Sanala, it will be operational within 3 years, and he expects an annual income of about $75 million once the project is operational. This particular refinery was first announced back in the early 80s, but it's been put on hold for decades before it was revived in 2017.
We hope this project will be beneficial and will encourage people in the south to stay in their lands instead of moving to the cities, making a reverse migration. This project should not be used by smugglers, since smuggling left a lot of bad impact on Libya. It's the responsibility of everybody, especially the local residents in the south, to take care of this project and preserve it.
Now on to Egypt, where a trio of state-owned banks have rolled out a $65 million fund designed to support fintech startups. Now the creation of this fund follows the recent adoption of a new law by Egyptian legislators to develop the country's fintech sector with the aim of expanding financial inclusion, but also cementing the country as one of the region's fintech hubs. Here's CGTN's Yasser Hakim with this report.
It's a shot in the arm for Egypt's startup ecosystem. The 1 billion Egyptian pounds, which is an equivalent of $65 million, is meant to target emerging fintech startups, and especially those that are in the initial stages. The fund is being established by the National Bank of Egypt, Bank Misr and Bank du Caire, under the watch of the central bank, and will support both local fintech startups and international outfits that want to establish themselves in the Egyptian market.
These startups face many issues, especially with financing their projects, plus other complications. The fund will help these companies grow. The banks have strong liquidity to pour more than the 1 billion Egyptian pounds. The youth have many innovative ideas in digital solutions that we have to make good use of, and this fund will help in this purpose.
There are a couple of success stories, such as Fawry e-payments, which became the first unicorn in the North African country. But experts believe there's potential for much more.
The impact of this fund will be big. It will nurture the talent we have. For instance, a country like India, where the youth work in software and financial technology, they export billions of dollars from this sector and rake in huge revenue. We have qualified, well-educated youth. Their talent is big, but unfortunately, they don't find the proper climate or tools to develop their services and products that allows them to take off. The fund will provide them with the suitable environment to produce innovative applications in this field.
Besides the fintech fund, the Central Bank of Egypt has amended regulations to attract Egyptians into the financial sector. Anyone can now open e-wallets, transfer cash through their mobiles, and sell products via contactless smartphone payments.
2 months ago, if you wanted to withdraw cash, you had to go to the bank or an ATM machine with your Visa card. Now, any point of sale in any kiosk can do the same service. There are about 500,000 point of sale terminals, and they're increasing. What do people want? Speed, ease of transactions, high security, and less costs. All this is provided by fintech and financial services.
The adoption of the new laws is expected to boost financial inclusion in the wider population, a key driver of investor interest in the fintech industry.
These efforts are meant to achieve financial inclusion. We have about 40 to 50 million youth who use the internet but don't have bank accounts. Financial technology puts them under the state's digital umbrella. Inclusion means everyone will have an account, if not a bank account. They'll have an account through a mobile application that will eventually lead them to open a bank account.
The central bank says through such initiatives, it hopes to transform Egypt into a regional hub for the financial technology industry. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Not so long ago, travellers missing the flights out of Uganda were pretty common occurrence, especially with the heavy traffic along Uganda's main road to the country's international airport in Entebbe. But now the 51-kilometre expressway linking Kampala and Entebbe has slashed travel time for pretty much anyone using that road. Here's Leon Sanyange with this report.
David Mulindwa is off to pick up a client. The tour and travel manager has to drive over 30 kilometers to the main airport. In previous years, an early departure was always necessary.
Having to drive tourists from Entebbe or having to drop tourists to Entebbe airport who have to catch a flight in a given time. And you estimate that, okay, maybe in an hour we'll be in Entebbe or we'll be in Kampala. But reaching the road from nowhere, jam, the road is packed.
Mulindwa now has little to worry about. The recently commissioned Entebbe-Kampala Express Highway gives him easy access to his destination. This highway stretches from the outskirts of the capital Kampala to the main international airport in Entebbe. What used to be a 2 hours long journey now takes about 30 minutes. Entebbe Airport is Uganda's major international airport. It also serves as the main entry point into the country. The new highway heading in and out of the airport was officially opened in 2018. It features 19 overbridges and 18 underpasses to provide access to nearby towns.
When you use the express, you don't have to go back to the city if you don't have anything to do there. You are bound to Western Uganda. You just connect through the express highway, and then you are on your destination.
The $476 million road project was jointly funded by the government of Uganda and the Exim Bank of China. The project took 6 years to complete, and it has transformed both the roadways and the surrounding landscape.
When you drive through the express highway, you can see the amount of infrastructure that people have put up, basically or mainly because of the road itself.
The government says motorists will start paying road tolls later this year. For Mulindwa, whether it is a pickup or a drop-off, the highway is already saving him time and money. Leon Senyange, CGTN, Entebbe, Central Uganda.
Now, trade flows between Nigeria and China last year, despite the COVID-19 pandemic, hit $20 billion, despite all the disruptions that came along with that particular event. But economic watchers worry that the West African nation is just benefiting from a fraction of that trade due to its heavy dependence on imports. CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam explains why.
Nigeria and China have had long-standing bilateral ties that have lasted more than 50 years. And trade relations between both countries continue to wax stronger. Nigeria is China's major investment destination in Africa. Statistics from Chinese embassy shows that in 2020 alone, trade volume was at $20 billion. In the first half of 2021, trade between China and Nigeria hit $11.2 billion, with a year-on-year growth rate of 44.5%.
I think, first and foremost, very good political mutual understanding and very great understanding between the leadership of the two sides has paved way for this. But more importantly, Nigerian robust market of more than 200 million people has been quite alluring to Chinese investors and Chinese business community.
But out of the total trade volume of $11.2 billion recorded in the first half of this year, exports from Nigeria to China stood at just $1.22 billion. That's about 10% of the total sum. Economic observers have expressed concerns over the trade imbalance.
You know that it is looking good for China and looking bad for us. It is so because while China is generating a lot of foreign exchange, Nigeria is obviously looking for foreign exchange to be able to import from China. But I can tell you that even as there is trade deficit against Nigeria, it's also creating a lot of business opportunities. It's also contributing to the GDP of Nigeria.
Economists advise both countries to work towards reducing the trade deficit by a substantial margin.
I think that China needs to step up on the currency swap so that we have more recourse to the yuan than to dollar.
There will be more of factories coming into Nigeria to establish so that we don't have to use foreign exchange to buy. We just produce and build a local capacity, and then we export to other countries in order for us to balance off the deficit.
Experts believe that were it not for the challenges caused by the pandemic fallout, foreign exchange crisis and insecurity, Nigeria could have recorded more gains in trade, more so as the West African nation's dependence on imports continue to threaten its prospects of a balance in trade. Economists say Nigeria will continue to deal with the pitfalls of being an import-dependent economy, and to increase its export capacity, the country would need to develop its infrastructures and rebuild its industries, and only then can it fairly match its imports. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
We're just past 18:30 GMT, time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. A top US diplomat is set to release a key policy statement on Sino-American relations. And the UK Prime Minister admits that Brexit is to blame for the current fuel crisis. The details coming up shortly.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Aviation, which are two of the major cities I grew up in.
Business in Africa is high risk.
After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. Let's run through some of the stories making your headlines at this hour. Starting in Libya. Investigators commissioned by the United Nations top human rights body say they have found evidence of possible war crimes and crimes against humanity in Libya. The body says a probe found that in particular crimes were committed against civilians and migrants who crossed the North African country trying to get to Europe, but they ended up being detained in horrific conditions. The Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has been sworn into office for a 5-year term. He took the oath of office, which was administered by the Supreme Court Chief Justice Miaza Ashinafi on Monday. Abiy's Prosperity Party was declared the winner of parliamentary elections held in July. Those polls, however, were boycotted by some opposition parties. The Prime Minister's party won 410 of the 436 parliamentary seats, which were being contested. Tunisian President Kais Saied said that a national dialogue that looks to end the country's political crisis will take place soon. That's according to a statement released by the French presidency following a phone conversation between President Saied and his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron. The opposition, however, has criticized the head of state's monopoly of powers. They say Saied is relying on foreign support to impose his rule and his one-sided vision of the process of national dialogue. And finally, yes, unfortunately, they're all still down. Facebook's suite of apps, including the photo-sharing platform Instagram and the messaging app WhatsApp, they're all still down for tens of thousands of users, according to outage tracking website downdetector.com. Now, shortly after the crash, user reports indicated that Amazon Web and Google and Twitter were also experiencing issues as well. That's a run through your headlines. Time for some much-needed digital detox, I guess. Let's move on to something else. Observers have been waiting to see what the Biden administration's approach to trade with China will be. A speech later today is likely to give a little more detail and insight into that. Here's Toby Muse with the details.
The administration of Joe Biden is set to reveal details of its China trade policy Monday in a speech to be delivered by U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai. Her remarks at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington will coincide with the start of the final 3 months of the Phase 1 U.S.-China trade deal struck back in early 2020 in the waning days of Donald Trump's presidency. While U.S. officials have suggested they're not satisfied with China's compliance in all aspects of that deal, China's ambassador to the United States, Qin Gang, says China has been faithfully implementing the Phase 1 agreement and called on the U.S. to work with China to create the necessary conditions and atmosphere for the implementation of the agreement. Monday's speech is expected to unveil the Biden administration's next steps and whether to try and negotiate a follow-on agreement. Further frustrating the deal, of course, was the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has slowed trade and disrupted supply chains around the globe. China has repeatedly said that improved trade relations are at the heart of improving larger ties between the two countries.
The true essence of China-U.S. economic and trade relations is mutual benefit and win-win. Fighting a trade war can only result in lose-lose. We hope that the U.S. can properly view the essence of China and U.S. economic and trade relations in the spirit of mutual respect and equal consultation, work with China to properly handle the economic and trade between the two countries, and promote the healthy and stable development of Sino-U.S. economic and trade relations.
President Biden has kept in place tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods that originated under his predecessor Donald Trump, despite his vocal criticism of the approach when he campaigned for office. Many American companies, economists, as well as the U.S.-China Business Council have urged the removal of the tariffs on goods traded between the world's two largest economies. International observers have been waiting to see what the Biden administration's approach to trade with China will be. So far, the White House has been light on specifics, although Biden has made clear he doesn't want conflict.
The United States will compete, and will compete vigorously, but we're not seeking, say it again, we are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks. The United States is ready to work with any nation that steps up and pursues peaceful resolution to shared challenges, even if we have intense disagreements in other areas, because we'll all suffer the consequences of our failure if we do not come together to address the urgent threats like COVID-19 and climate change, or enduring threats like nuclear proliferation.
Tai has been carrying out what the administration calls a top-to-bottom review of U.S. trade policy regarding China since taking office in March. She has said that the results of that review will be completed soon without committing to a date. As part of the Phase 1 agreement, she and Chinese Vice Premier Liu He were supposed to meet every 6 months. She's had one phone conversation with Liu back in May. It was reported at the time that the conversation was candid, practical and constructive. Toby Muse reporting for CGTN, Washington.
The UK's Prime Minister says that the country's fuel supply problems are partly because, he said, of a post-Brexit period of adjustment. The British Army will be delivering fuel to petrol stations from Monday after a critical shortage of lorry drivers caused many forecourts in the south to run dry. CGTN's Michael Voss reports from London.
The Prime Minister has warned that there is no quick fix for scenes like these, with Britain in for what he called a period of adjustment. Boris Johnson said that the lack of lorry drivers is partly due to low pay and poor conditions, and that the free movement of cheap labour pre-Brexit was the real problem.
The way forward for our country is not to just pull the big lever marked uncontrolled immigration and allow in huge numbers of people. What we would rather do is help people into better paid, better skilled jobs, which is what is happening.
With the fuel crisis now in its second week, there are signs that sufficient petrol deliveries are getting through in some parts of the country. But in London and the southeast, some reports suggest that the situation is getting worse, with lines of motorists getting longer and longer.
If you find fuel without visiting 6 or 7 garages, then you're very lucky.
Starting on Monday, around 100 military personnel will be driving petrol tankers in a bid to ease the shortage of lorry drivers, the main reason that fuel is not reaching the forecourts from the refineries. Driver training courses have also been ramped up, though it will take time to take effect. The government is now offering longer 6-month visas to attract foreign drivers, but warns that increased immigration is just a short-term solution. Farmers, though, complain that even with higher wages, they can't attract enough local people for what is generally unskilled physical labour. This, along with the driver problem, has seen empty shelves in supermarkets. And it's not just unskilled workers. Health service and business leaders complain that they're having trouble attracting enough managers and professionals. But it's the panic buying at petrol stations that has focused minds on the problems, providing a political headache for the ruling Conservative Party as it meets for its annual party conference. Michael Voss, CGTN, London.
Onto the world of aviation. Boeing plans to set up 2 conversion lines in Guangzhou next year to turn 767 passenger planes into cargo freighters. The deal was announced at the Zhuhai Air Show. It'll make the city Boeing's biggest freighter conversion center anywhere on the planet. Wang Fei finds out what this means for the industry.
Amoco, a maintenance, repair and overhaul provider part-owned by China Southern Airlines, already runs 3 737 conversion lines through earlier deals with Boeing. The new deal adds wide-body jets into the mix.
This year, we still hired nearly 600 people in Amoco, because we are growing. We also built a new hangar at the Bayonne airport that will be ready end of this year. And we are building a maintenance campus with a component center and composite repair center. And these facilities together, I think they will add about 1,500 to 2,000 jobs over the time when they're in full swing.
Aircraft that have been parked because of COVID travel restrictions are the most likely candidates for conversions. Of special interest are models that are about to retire from passenger operations, but are still considered young for cargo fleets.
With an online shopping boom and an urgent global demand for vaccines and medical supplies, it's hardly surprising that airlines would want to make up for lost revenues by carrying cargo instead of passengers. The International Air Transport Association projects 30% of global aviation revenues this year will come from freights, more than doubling pre-COVID levels.
Amoco Beijing, another leading aircraft maintenance supplier in China, is also joining a conversion boom. They recently landed a deal with the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China to convert the ARJ-21 short and medium-range jet for emergency use.
In the COVID era, there is a demand for specialized corporate charters that can act as command posts during an emergency. They have good comms on board to coordinate emergency responses, bringing key officials and experts to where they are most needed. Another type of conversion is air ambulances, making sure medical supplies and care can be delivered in time, even when normal commercial airline flights are disrupted.
Amoco is also fielding the needs among airlines to upgrade their aging fleets, making aircraft virus-proof, so to speak, and more passenger-friendly. That includes installing contactless restrooms and better in-flight entertainment. So when travel comes back to pre-crisis levels, airlines will have all they need to win back customers. Hong Fei, CGTN at Airshow China 2021, Zhuhai, Guangdong Province.
Electrifying classic cars has been an increasingly popular trend in many parts of the US for the better part of a decade now. Many vintage car enthusiasts are looking to replace their old, inefficient combustion engines in their cars with battery-powered, silent but powerful electric motors in order to expand the lifespan while making a positive impact on the environment. To be fair, it's still far from the mainstream, but the conversion for aftermarket cars is a pretty complicated process, and it's often a hefty investment too. CGTN's Edith Tiantian has visited one of the pioneer companies in Southern California in this space, specializing in the engineering and building of electric car solutions for classic vehicles.
Eric Hutchison used his retirement funds to build the world's first electric Ferrari, a 78 model classic he initially bought from a salvage market.
When this is converted, it'll knock your socks off. I mean, this, if you blip the accelerator at 40, 50 miles an hour, if you're not sure what you're doing, this could easily be going backwards.
Oh, wow.
You spin it out quickly. It's got half the weight of a Tesla with the same amount of power.
The successful project gave birth to his company, Electric GT, one of the few companies providing individual solutions for the electric conversions of vintage cars.
The first process, de-icing, removing all internal combustion engine requirements. Rip that gas tank out, rip that engine out. Then you say, how much power do I want, how much range do I want, and how much money do I want to spend? There's a big range of options to put into the vehicle, and you can make what was an unreliable classic car super reliable, daily drivable, and really fun to drive.
What's better than driving an iconic 1965 convertible Mustang? Well, some would say having one that is all electric. These kinds of conversions are now becoming increasingly popular among vintage car users who want to make their vehicle more reliable for daily use and even add more performance.
Depending on the desired performance, range, and other factors, conversions can cost anywhere from $20,000 all the way up to $100,000. A team of engineers works on building new models for electric motor blocks that include the engine, the battery, and all other components that an electric vehicle needs. Aside from fitting it all in a small space, getting the right weight balance is also key.
When we talk about pushing batteries and putting them around vehicles, you can see we do a tremendous amount of studies on where to place batteries in vehicles.
Batteries are the key to electric cars, and the majority are produced in China. Developing smaller, lighter, and cheaper batteries could make EV conversions more accessible to a wider range of clients and cars, according to the company's chief technology officer.
Tesla started out with a really expensive Roadster, and now they've gotten to their Model 3, which was their goal, right, is to make it to something more affordable. So we're working very much in that same fashion, and we're trying to prove out the concepts and make them palpable for people, and then eventually it will get to a better price point.
But until then, it's a luxury afforded by those who will pay big bucks to keep their vintage car on the road, and more powerful than ever before.
Especially in the aftermarket crowd, people want high horsepower numbers and fast acceleration. And electrics are really good at doing that. A great byproduct is, of course, that it's better for the environment long term.
In the long term, an investment in EV conversion makes up for the cost of decades of fuel consumption while leaving a green footprint on the environment. It is Tianshan, CGTN, Los Angeles.
Right, then a quick update on commodities. We did cover this a little earlier in the hour. Brent crude went as high as $82 a barrel today. Essentially, that takes it up to a gain of 60% over the last 9 months. On paper, that should be a fantastic thing for the continent's oil exporters, if you're Nigeria, for example. But the picture is a bit more nuanced than that. Nigeria's output, in fact, has been in constant decline. 2020 output was 11% lower year on year compared to the pre-pandemic levels in 2019. At 1.27 million barrels a day of output in August, output then was nearly 30% lower compared to pre-pandemic levels, roughly 500,000 barrels a day of output, essentially offline. Oil is not the only commodity having a crazy price surge in 2021, though. Copper futures in New York, they're over $200 today, up over 51% on a year-to-date basis. Here's what's coming up next. The use of biofuel is gaining traction in Kenya in a bid to reduce carbon emissions. That story is coming up shortly. Welcome back. Large blue boxes that look like ATM machines have been popping up across the Kenyan capital. But instead of dispensing cash, they're giving out clean cooking fuel that's both good for the environment and safer to use than traditional wood or kerosene. Here's Alexander Majala with that story on Grassroots.
In Kenya's capital, Nairobi, restaurant owner Miriam Kamau lifts a steaming ladle of food from a stove burning locally produced ethanol, a fuel made from the byproducts of sugar production. She's one of about 200,000 customers of 3-year-old Kenyan company Cocoa, who have replaced fuels like charcoal, kerosene and liquefied petroleum gas with locally produced ethanol. Ethanol from agricultural waste helps cut down on greenhouse emissions, partly because consumers won't be using charcoal made from cutting down trees.
I am using the waste of the product that was used to make sugar and molasses and so on to create something that I can still reutilize it again and recycle it. So all in a way to try and also meet up with the climatic requirements we have now, the climatic conditions now. We've known we have destroyed quite a bit of our forest coverage and so on and so forth.
The United Nations Environmental Programme says sugarcane bioethanol can reduce emissions by 40 to 62% compared to petroleum-derived fuels. Cocoa's locally produced bioethanol is made of agricultural waste, sugarcane that has already been processed to make sugar and molasses that would otherwise be thrown away. Customers like it because it's cheaper.
I have been operating this business for 7 years and have actually been using cocoa fuel for 3 years. I think I was among the first people in this area to use it when it came into the market. Since I started using it in those 3 years, it has helped me a lot. I don't even know the price of cooking gas anymore.
Cocoa sells a litre of its biofuel for 70 US cents. The minimum purchase is 30 cents. A litre of kerosene in Nairobi costs $1 US, while gas can only be bought in more expensive canisters.
Because it has 2 burners, I can cook 2 meals at the same time. In about 5 minutes, you are done with all your cooking. It has really helped me because cooking gas costs me $10 to refill. But cocoa, I can even get 100 shillings worth of fuel.
Cocoa distributes its fuel using dispensers around Nairobi that allow customers to buy any amount of fuel using mobile money services. The potential market is huge. According to the WHO, around 900 million people in Africa use dirty fuel for cooking, contributing to air pollution that causes an estimated 500,000 premature deaths on the continent each year. Kenya has given ethanol producers using sugar processing waste an exemption from the 16% value-added tax to encourage ethanol production to grow in tandem with the sugar industry, one of the nation's common crops. Cocoa plans to expand to 10 other Kenyan towns in the near future. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
Farmers in Egypt are cultivating land to make it suitable for the growth of the silkworm in order to increase production of silk for local use and to decrease exports. Currently, the North African nation produces around 1.5 tons of natural silk every year. It's a fragment of what it consumes every year, and that often leaves a massive gap that imports have to fill.
Engineer Sameh Fouad designated a plot of land in Giza for the cultivation of high-quality mulberry trees known to attract silkworms.
Silk production is a very profitable business in Egypt and is very easy for young people to do. We offer training courses in order to teach people silk production, and we also offer courses for students at the Faculty of Agriculture because they are the most suitable for the process of our project. We conduct training courses for people who want to learn more about silk production and also give practical training because not everyone can open a farm and start operating without training first.
His small-scale business has recorded a profit, but more is needed if producers are to meet the country's growing demand.
In order to fill the gap between production and consumption, the state should support youth in the production of silk as well as young investors. The international network must also help transfer new technologies in producing mulberries and harvesting silkworms. This will always pay back because we will put a large portion of youth to work. Every step in silk production requires manpower. Women specifically can have over 60% presence in this project.
Silk production is a costly project requiring not only large numbers of workers but also a knowledge of modern techniques still unfamiliar to many.
The problem with these projects is that they're still in the very early stages and don't have the production capacity of commercial quantities. The problem is that one silk cocoon produces around 3 grams of silk, so you'll need hundreds of thousands of cocoons just to make 1 ton.
Mohammed says the silk-made carpets are the most expensive because they're woven out of silk imported from China.
Chinese silk, which is the best silk in the world, you'll need to pay a high price, with the high price of the dollar and the VAT. 1 kilogram of Chinese silk today costs you around $127, and if the silk carpet we make here is 64 knots, which is 640,000 knots per square meter, that takes you around 4 or 4.5 kilos on the loom. You're talking about $572.5 for raw material, only that it is not even dyed yet. So if we say $572.5 of raw material plus the manpower it takes to weave 640,000 knots, then of course the cost will be very high. The production cost after all of these calculations is close to $954 to $1,017.7. How much then will I sell it for? And who will buy it?
Last year, Egypt's Ministry of Finance scrapped import tariffs on silkworm eggs to boost local production in the industry. But producers say more is needed to jumpstart nationwide manufacturing to reduce imports. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
And that's where we're going to leave it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. Many ways to get your feedback back to us. All of them are on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.